Hey, welcome everyone. We are so excited. Welcome to our fourth day of our second annual Joining Our Voices Symposium on Envisioning the Future of Serious Illness Care. I am Heather Altman. I'm Executive Director of the North Carolina Serious Illness Coalition, and we are thrilled you're joining us for the fourth of five. Tomorrow will be our last session of what have already proven to be engaging and thought-provoking and meaningful and just really touching sessions. So we're thrilled you are joining us today. Tomorrow's session's a little different. It is at 11 a.m. For those curious why it is not at the same time, it's because the North Carolina Serious Illness Coalition generally meets on the third Fridays of the month at 11. And so we knew that a lot of people already had it held. So tomorrow's session, same Zoom link, will be at 11 o'clock, all on envisioning the future of serious illness care and envisioning tomorrow. So we'll talk more about that at the end. Please take a moment to put your name and organization, if you're coming from an organization, in the chat line. If you have questions, or comments, yesterday the chat line was blowing up with all kinds of comments, and so it is its own world. Feel free to use the chat line. We do ask that you keep your microphones muted during the program, and for the best viewing, choose speaker view, and all of the speakers have been spotlighted, so you'll be able to see all of them. If this is the first time that you're joining a North Carolina Serious Illness Coalition event, I'll share briefly that we are a statewide partnership to advance the quality of life and quality of care for patients and families experiencing and touched by serious illness. Through collective engagement of our active work groups, we look at clinical practice and quality, advanced care planning, caregiver and patient engagement, all through a variety of communications, advocacy, and educational efforts. You are all welcome to join the coalition. There is no charge. To learn more about the coalition, you can go to www.ncsicoalition.org. You see it, okay, right there. Okay, I can't do it. And I'll also put it in the chat line. And if you would like to join our listserv, just go ahead and you can also put your email in the chat line, and I'll make sure to add you to our listserv. We try not to bombard you. Usually about twice a month, we send out reminders and information. Many thanks to the coalition members for developing this symposium. Each day, a different work group took on the session and created the panel based on their specific topic. And so today's shout out for organizing and their leadership goes to the clinical practice and quality group. And so many thanks to all the work group members that helped, and especially today's moderator and also one of the organizers, Christine Lau. And I'm going to turn it over to that now. Have a great session. And Christine and panelists, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Heather. And I'm so thrilled to be here with an esteemed panel for our conversation. Our topic today is Books to Bedside, the Art of Serious Illness Conversations. And we've been really intentional about asking panelists from various schools in North Carolina and from different disciplines, because what we recognize is these conversations need to happen by all members of a healthcare team, and really speaking to the art of that conversation. And as we know, there's good research that shows it's not about the document. And I think we all know that. It's not about the healthcare power of attorney document, the living will. It's about the conversations. And this is not just a one-time conversation. And the reality that there is an art to it. And I'm so excited to get to be speaking to that today. As Heather mentioned, my name is Christine Lau. I am part of the North Carolina Serious Illness Coalition and have been serving as one of the co-leads for our clinical practice work group. And so proud to be moderating today. My background is I am a registered nurse and a licensed clinical social worker, and I've been working in the serious illness space for the last 25 years as both clinician as well as leading programs and consulting. So I would love to have a chance to have our panelists introduce themselves, and we'll get started. We do want this to be a conversation. And so that means we welcome your questions, and we've got wonderful folks monitoring the chat. And so we look forward to this conversation. But Denisa, if you could start us off with introductions.
Yes, absolutely. First, I want to thank the coalition. Heather, thank you for inviting me to participate. I'm super excited about being here. I'm looking at all the names of and where folks are coming from, and I'm a little concerned that this is going to be preaching to the choir, but we're actually going to be talking about that today too. Like Christine said, my name is Denisa Dews. I am a faculty member at UNC Chapel Hill. I have been in academia for 19 years. I was with the School of Social Work up till 2 months ago, and I jumped ship and went over to the School of Medicine. I teach the interdisciplinary, interprofessional, end-of-life, death and dying course in it falls in the School of Social Work and the School of Nursing. I've been teaching that for many years, and I'm continuing. I have a joint appointment over at the School of Social Work, so I'll continue to be teaching that course. My practice background before coming into academia is in the acute care setting and helping families who have received a life-limiting or life-threatening diagnosis and helping them navigate both the healthcare system and decision-making and advanced care planning and helping families cope. So thank you for allowing me to be here.
Thank you, Denisa. Dr. Clifton, if you could go next, please.
Absolutely. Good morning. I really appreciate you guys having me. My name is Maggie Clifton, Dr. Maggie Clifton. I wear a few different hats. So clinically, I am the medical director for ECU Health Home Hospice and Inpatient Hospice here in Greenville, North Carolina. I'm also the program director for the Geriatric Fellowship, as well as the Hospice and Palliative Care Fellowship with ECU. And so very excited to be joining you guys today.
Thank you so much. And Keith, if you could give us introductions.
Sure. I'm Keith Starwalt. I'm with Atrium Health Wake Forest Baptist, which is part of Advocate Health. And I am both a chaplain and a physician assistant. The things involved with this, I help teach a class for the medical school that certainly touches on advanced care planning. But I'm speaking today really more from the perspective of teaching physician assistant students with some things that we are doing that we think is innovative, and also teaching hospital chaplains to do this, because a lot of the work in our hospital system, when it comes to advanced care planning, those conversations actually occurs from our chaplain residents.
Well, thank you so much. We are honored to have such a wonderful panel today and looking forward to this conversation. I want to start us off with a question of, what do you find to be the greatest challenge to prepare future clinicians doing this art of serious illness conversations?
We're all going to be, go ahead, Keith.
You're all too humble to start, so.
We're
Keith,
fighting over
your
who's
hand.
The most humble. For me, I would say, I think just the lack of exposure to these conversations. So I work primarily with medical students. And by the time they get to third and fourth year, they haven't had a lot of exposure to doing these conversations. And then as a medical student, you get the exposure, but then you're thrown into residency and expected to have that conversation. So you go from being a witness to being the person to have the conversation. And so I think a lack of exposure early on is one of the barriers that I see in future clinicians.
Thank you.
I'm going to echo that. Thank you, Maggie. I teach graduate level courses, and we have social workers, nurses, medical students, people from psychology, public health, pharmacy. And if we get 35 to 40 students a year, we consider that a coup. And that's of thousands of students, and they self-select. So they're the ones that are interested. But even of those that self-select, some of those students have never been to a funeral. They've never known someone that has died. they've never known someone that's had a serious illness. So I think just initiating that conversation and having some exposure is that's the greatest obstacle for me.
So
Like you,
echoing those things, since my time is primarily spent with first and second year medical students, first year PA students, and chaplain residents who are postgraduate but first year. Unfortunately, these classroom experiences tend to happen in what I call fire hose periods, where they're still trying to learn the lay of the land, and there's so many things that are important for them to learn. This ends up just being another thing. And as you all have kind of touched on, the conversation part of this doesn't involve just knowledge; it involves wisdom and comfort, and it's difficult for first year students to even enter into that comfortable space because they're not seeing a lot of it, and they're also worried about passing any number of tests, or, and frankly, trying to find out where the cafeteria is.
I'm wondering if you find what assumptions do you find that your students come in with? You know, and I'm hearing Denise said that yours are self-selecting, and Dr. Maggie and Keith, your students are often trying to assimilate a lot of things at once. Do you notice, I'm hearing from you, Denise, that, there's a lot of people who've not had life experience that would give them any context. Does that impact some of the assumptions they come in with for these conversations?
I think it does. I think even if they've had an experience, I think they make an assumption that they're prepared to have that conversation with other people. And I don't think that's always the case. So we do a lot of role playing in the course. I learned a long time ago that chronological age does not translate to maturity. I've met many very mature 21-year-olds who are able to engage in these conversations. And I've met many 45-year-olds that take the course that are not adept at the art of having this conversation.
Yeah, so I think the assumptions that I experience probably most often are two. So I'm going to just highlight two. And I know we're only talking about serious illness conversation, so I'm not going to talk just about death. But I do think that one of the assumptions that I run into a lot with providers at any stage, so learners at any stage, not just medical students, is that death is a failure. And so they come in expecting, like, not to be the person to have that conversation because death doesn't happen. It's a far away thing that people don't experience. And so I think that's the first assumption. The second assumption that I think and I know we're going to talk about progress that's being made, but I think the second assumption is that only the palliative care team needs to have these conversations. So I do palliative care consults, and I think that the assumption I see from other teams is that we're the only people capable or willing or able to have these conversations, and that is just not true. And so I'm glad that we have this coalition today. We're having this conversation because I think medical students and residents, and again, other physicians already in practice, think that I'm the only person that can come in and have a serious or difficult conversation. So I think that's really the biggest assumption I run into.
And that's ironic, given that most people want to have these conversations with physicians, providers who they have a relationship with and trust.
Exactly.
And so there's that avoidance, and that's a challenge. Keith, what would you share?
Echoing Denise's comment about the lack of personal experience with death, I think sometimes in working with people who have not experienced the randomness with which horrible things happen, I think, as y'all have indicated, we're talking to the choir primarily today. We live in a world where random things happen, where bad things happen to good people, and not just, death is not reserved for people my age and older. And I think that enters into this as well, that this is not a specialty I'm going to go into I will say, to interject and kind of riff off of other things said, the spiritual components of many of these conversations are, for a good many of our patients, are many. And so, I think that that's one of the advantages of having trained chaplains, and I'm saying trained. I want y'all to hear that heavily. That's another conversation. To allow a safe space for people to enter into the spiritual components of the conversation, because for many of us, we don't separate the spiritual and the physical and the psychological. They're all integrated. And so that's, I think, the beauty sometimes of having different disciplines being able to enter these conversations.
Keith, I think that's such a good point, because this is an art, because if it were just an algorithmic checklist of give this information this time, there wouldn't be an art to it. But you hit the nail on the head as far as we are mind, body, spirit combined. And it's not just about information. It's about, what does this information mean to me? Do I feel safe enough to ask questions? There's so many things that are an art to it, which is why it's so important to have opportunities to train this, because it's not something we can give them a quiz, they got it, they're good to go. I've got a question in the chat about thoughts about self-selecting versus mandatory training. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'll tackle that. I think with the accreditation bodies of nursing and social work and medicine requiring so much in a curriculum, it is hard to just add another thing. And not all social workers are going to go into healthcare. Not all pharmacists are going to be doing direct patient care. So they're not interested in. So I'm not sure that's going to be in the curriculum. However, while I don't think it should be required, I think it should be offered more frequently. And I think there should be greater latitude across curriculums to allow for electives. I will say there is very little room for electives across all the curriculums. And so taking a course on the care of the dying and bereaved is an elective. It's in the evening. And students that take it are thrilled, but after students have had a full day of classes, they don't always want to continue.
Yeah, great points. Maggie?
Yeah, I might take the opposite stance, to be honest with you. I totally agree, Denise, and echo that there's just so many things that you have to cover. I'm constantly looking at the guidelines. I have to make sure that the fellows are meeting, right? But and again, I want to say that I think interdisciplinary group work is honestly the most important part of this. But I think just from a physician standpoint, I do wish that having training and difficult conversations was mandatory, because I think that we often have this conversation about end of life scenarios or hard diagnoses. But I think that in getting training in how to have a difficult conversation teaches a lot of communication styles that we as physicians don't get a lot of. And so I think what I'm finding, so here at ECU Health, one of the things that we do is we do Vital Talks, which is a standardized training method on how to have difficult conversations. And we offer that across the board to any clinician, not only physicians. So really anyone can take the class. But most of our medical students get it in their 4th year. And a lot of our residents also get it during their training here. And what I find is that even if providers aren't going into palliative and hospice care or geriatrics, where we have a lot of these conversations, I think it's really necessary, to be honest, that they learn how to just respond in a empathetic way, just respond to frustrated patients, because I didn't feel like I received a lot of that. And I think that it helps become a more well-rounded physician. So I say that because I think that sometimes people who have no interest in doing end of life care tend to stay away from those conversations. But I do think that there's value in learning how to have a hard conversation, regardless of what field you end up in.
Yeah. And I think the art of serious illness conversations is so much more broad than end of life. And I do think that's an assumption a lot of people bring to it. It's like, well, I'm not going to work, like you said, Maggie, well, my patients aren't going to die because that's a failure, number one. And I'm not going into that field, where in reality, there's going to be an importance of communication skills, responding to emotion. And there's going to be difficult decisions that every single medical provider is going to have. It may be a diagnosis of cancer. It may be a diagnosis of diabetes. What that means to the patient is going to be very different. And so I think that's a great point. Keith, from a physician's assistant standpoint, where do you feel like it makes sense as far as mandatory versus self-selecting?
So I would say that across the disciplines, there should be a minimum amount of factual information that needs to go across, and realizing that we don't want, and pardon the term, hostages. That's are you a volunteer? Are you a hostage in this place? I will say that the use of standardized patients, which I've actually, even at my advanced age, only been involved in medical education for about the past decade. The increasing use of standardized patients, I think, helps what we're talking about. And one of the neat things that we're doing here, because as I like to say, I teach med students a lot, I teach PA students a little, and they hardly let me teach chaplains anything. So I want you all to weigh that for what it means. But one of the neat things that we do is in fact, it's going to come up next Tuesday, once a year, we will take our chaplain residents and put them in a standardized patient situation with first-year PA students. They will then go in and have a family meeting with someone, with a blended family. I actually wrote the script for this, so we've got some family dynamics, but we have some of those spiritual components we talked about, and we put these students into this very uncomfortable space. I will tell you, both from statistics that we kept when this was an RB-led study, to what we're just seeing each year, students come out of this saying, wow, this was hard, but this was far more rewarding than I thought it was going to be. And I really, I understand now how important it is. There's also that interprofessional education component of this, where each group comes out understanding a little bit more about what the other does, how they can work together to get these conversations in place. So that's a neat thing that we do.
And Keith, is that required?
That is required. So it is, I teach 2 courses to the PA students, are actually classes prior to this event. One's on spirituality and medicine. How do we deal with the various spiritualities that we encounter and honor them as in a form of cultural humility? And the other is about end of life and advanced care planning. And so the culmination of this is the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. The students that we have in both campuses actually will have these encounters.
There's a great question in the chat about how do you, as a panel, how do you see the organizational culture impacting the uptake, support, and quote unquote comfort with regard to these conversations? Because I think you're all bringing forth some good points as far as mandatory, not mandatory, and maybe it being really dependent upon the discipline. But how do you see the culture of the organizations and of hospitals, et cetera? I think all of you are coming from universities tied to a health system. So what would your thoughts be there? Keith, do you want to?
Sure. Well, frankly, I owe my job here at the hospital, although it's changed about 4 or 5 times since I've come, to the hospital system, saying we need to pay better attention. We need to be doing a better job of this. I think I came in somewhat naive, although I tend to think naivete is one of God's gifts, because we never get married, have kids, et cetera, if we work a bit naive. I do think that, the system that I'm involved with, but actually looking at the coalition, it's evidence that the culture is slowly changing, and we're realizing this is important. Yeah, we're still missing the mark. Let's be honest. We're not anywhere close to where I think any of us would like to be, but there are a lot of good hearts and minds involved, and realizing this is important to how we treat our patients. So I think the culture of the system that I'm part of is, again, paying focus on this, but we're also, having to pay focus on the gazillion other things. We talked about students of medicine, how many different things they're focused on. Well, so are systems. We're all trying to survive right now. And this is the 7 thin cows are starting to eat the 7 thick cows, for those of you who know that biblical reference.
I think, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Maggie, go ahead.
I think that having buy-in from an organization or even the leadership is hugely important, especially for creating time. Because I think one of the things that we're not talking about is, in order to either have the training or get to a comfort level with these things, you have to have time to do those. And sometimes in our jobs, time is difficult to come by.
Yeah, I'm yes and yes to what both Maggie and Keith said. I have seen a significant shift in organizational culture. I mean, 25 years ago, there was very few continuing education opportunities that were just available to both physicians as well as other disciplines. And the medical students that I'm seeing now, I'm seeing more that are interested in learning and having and engaging in these conversations. Because I will tell you, 25, 30 years ago, the only physicians that were engaging in these conversations were emerging palliative care and pulmonologists. They always seem to be the ones that were having these advanced conversations.
I think one of the ways we have been naive is that we thought by getting as many of these documents done as we could, things were going to change. The water was going to be sweeter, the air would be fresher, and just as you've indicated, that alone is just a smidge of what needs to happen. I think our systems are waking up to the fact that having a document in the chart, while it makes us feel better, doesn't always make a difference when you're in that family meeting room. We can always say, well, here's the healthcare power of attorney, and here's who the healthcare agent is. We all know that the family situations that we encounter don't allow that simplicity to just solve everything and us to walk away.
But having, unfortunately, that document becoming a checklist item, and it being separated from the conversation, I think is where we were naive as as a medical community. I like Tamara in the comments mentioned she's in South Carolina, and they've all been trained on the serious illness conversation from Adriana Labs, and now that is incorporated into the template in their EHR. And so I think those are some great examples of how these things can be tied together, of that learning and then that application, which is so important. And speaking of application of this information, when you're teaching future clinicians, are there recommended activities or strategies that you use to engage them that you find to be especially helpful? I know, Keith, you mentioned the work with actors who are portraying patients,
which is expensive. And so to go to your points about time and expense. And by the way, one of my retirement strategies is to be a standardized patient. It looks like a lot of fun, but it is quite a bit of expense. It takes a lot of medical school personnel to make these things come across. I feel like that's very effective, and far more effective, that, by the way, than having students pair up and have mock conversations or even real conversations with each other.
Yeah. The Institute for Healthcare Improvement started a conversation project several years ago, and if you go to their website, you can see several games that they recommend. One is the Hello game. And if anybody on this has ever done that, it is an incredible game. It opens up conversations. You do it in a small group, and it is not just focused on end of life. It's focused on serious illness. It's focused on what's your favorite music. Other activities that I do, YouTube. Students love YouTube. There are some incredible examples of poor communication. Duke has done a series of poor communication, and then with the same actors, they do the same scenario with positive communication. And students really like that. So we try to do something interactive every week. We have the students do advanced directives. And even though advanced directives may not be the end all, having an advanced directive is a springboard for the conversation. And I have seen families just kind of melt in gratefulness when someone says, your mom had an advanced directive and this is what she wanted. And being able to follow that. And so the students do advanced directives, and we give a tour, we go on a tour of a funeral home. So those are some of the activities that we do.
Yeah, just to echo those, I think that there is a lot of value in working with a standardized patient. So we do, for our Vital Talks training, we use standardized patients. But like he said, it's a lot of time and money and energy for those standardized patients to really know how to, I hate to use the word act because we want it to feel realistic, but respond in those situations. I think that that provides a lot of value. And then I also think giving really anyone a framework of how to have these conversations. So I think that there's value in seeing a conversation, but also providing people tools. So if they are in a situation where they're thrown into a conversation, because some people try to avoid these conversations, right? They're going to do everything that they can to not have to have a conversation like this. But really providing people with some tools. And so one of those tools that I try to tell everyone regardless is just expecting and responding to emotion. And so I think that's a very small thing that you can teach any clinician in any conversation to respond to. So to go back to things that we were talking about, as a resident, I would get really uncomfortable if I had a patient that was really angry, even if it wasn't about an end of life conversation. They were angry about, you know, something happening in the hospital or something that I wasn't doing, and just knowing how to respond to anger from a patient. But really, I think showing people and giving them kind of a pathway and different tools that they can use if they're in those conversations is helpful.
No, I think that's a great point, you know, that, and I think one of the things that I'm seeing a theme of is that these are skills that are worthwhile to all clinicians in all situations. And yet they're relegated to serious illness, which is often assumed to be end of life. And I'm hearing some, you know, some movement in that. I love the interprofessional education. You know, there is a comment in the chat of how can we get this to be thought of more broadly? And these aren't, you know, it goes back to, you know, self-selecting versus mandatory. What elements of these conversations need to be thought of as separate? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are of how we could expand this more.
Well, I'm just right off the bat very encouraged to hear of the work that Denisa and Keith are doing. I think Denisa said she was working with first and second year medical students in the, oh my gosh, I'm gonna mess up all your words, but I am really encouraged. So to me, that's very encouraging to hear about people from, you know, every part of this interdisciplinary group working with learners at every stage. Keith is working with PA students and medical students and chaplains. And to me, that's very encouraging and very necessary.
Yeah, I agree. I will tell you that when I was in nursing school, not only was these were not things that were taught, but there was such an emphasis on what is within your scope of practice. And while licensure is incredibly important, I think, especially I think in nursing, there seems to be this restrictive nature of, well, you can't talk about that. It's like, well, if you are present with a medical provider who it is within their scope of practice to speak to prognostication, you can certainly answer questions and continue on those conversations. And I think that's an incredibly important role for nurses and others in the hospital to do. I'm wondering if in your spheres, if you see some misunderstanding of scope of practice for these conversations.
Going back to Dr. Clifton's thing that, oh, this is palliative care does this. We don't need to do this. And of course, palliative care gets called in during the 2-minute warning.
Right.
I think that's one of the aspects, and I really do see this as someone said in the chat, a holistic approach, and would like to point one other thing that it's kind of bothered me over the years, and that is we're looking at this as a supply issue. When excusing the term, I think we should be working on demand, and that is that whether we like it or not, and it hurts my heart sometimes, a lot of the public doesn't trust us, doesn't trust the medical institution. Mm-hmm. So coming and talking about any of this stuff, just when they already don't trust us, that's another barrier. I really think we need to do a better job of working with community leaders. That includes in faith communities. There's no reason why we can't teach them to do 80% of this, mm-hmm. so that they have people have someone they trust to talk about serious illness and end of life, and to start those conversations within that context. And so, that's one thing. I'll be honest with you, I have not been able to broach that from time restrictions, but I think we're missing something here. If our patients were demanding this, if our patients, it would make us step up our game. That sounds very damning, doesn't it? But that's not the kind of minister I am, actually, but that's okay.
And I fear our patients are not going to demand it because they're not going to think about it until they need it.
Yeah.
We are a death-denying culture as a whole in the United States. And so that, I think you're right. There is going to be an avoidance. There's a reason that our providers that we're teaching are death denying. It's the culture that most of them are coming from, and turning that tide will take time.
Normalization,
mm-hmm.
in and out of the hospital. Normalization.
Yes. I am wondering, if are there often related perceptions that patient or families may have that are common stumbling blocks in these conversations? Things such as, a belief, we're hoping for a miracle, or we only want to hear positive things, and any examples that you have, and wondering how do you teach these clinicians on how to address those things? Because that is definitely an art.
I feel like I'm talking too much. A miracle is not a stop sign. And I think too frequently we see that, we hear that term and we just, it's like, oh, dear God. Oh, it's not a stop sign. It actually is another entry into a conversation. By the way, miracle language, which pops up out of nowhere, may actually be a family's way or a patient's way of saying, I've had all I can take right now. I'm going to do something to slow the process down. As I know my colleagues know here, that the next question should be, what does a miracle in this case look like to you? And to realize that hopefully that's going to morph based on context. So for some people, yes, it is that Hallmark movie, suddenly Keith picks up his mat and walks out of the hospital thing that happens. But frequently that concept of a miracle will change. And again, be an entry into a conversation we need to be more comfortable with.
Absolutely.
I think one of the things we talk to students about is asking patients, what is their hope for today? Is your hope for today to get through the day pain free. So trying to break it down for what their hope is for the moment.
I think that both of those are really wonderful points. I think kind of going back to what Keith said, I think two things. I think when families almost see having this conversation as like the door opening to like giving up, right? We have this conversation and it means that I've accelerated towards death. I've accelerated towards, not choosing to life, right? So we think about this as like life or death. And of course, if you ask most people, they're going to choose life over death every single time. But I think with physicians, especially, and I go back to physicians just because that's who I spend a lot of my time training. And no offense to any other physician on the call, but I'll use myself as an example. I feel like oftentimes we are the people who need need a lot more of this. I think people who go into to be chaplains and social workers and nursing have that like innate ability to be a human being. And physicians sometimes forget. I don't know what it is about us, but we forget sometimes to just be a normal human being. But I think the miracle word, just like they don't know how to respond to that. Or, God will take care of me. So I am a very religious person. I am the daughter of two pastors, and I think that has something to do about why I ended up in this line of work. So I always encourage a few things. One, I think that this is where having interdisciplinary partners is very, very helpful. And so we all have different strengths and gifts. And I think finding someone whose gift and strength and job it is to have those conversations, so pulling your chaplain into these conversations is very important, because it isn't, I don't claim that it's my skill or my gift to have really deeply religious conversations, but I feel comfortable having that. So I do talk about things like that. The other thing that I tell people is to try to avoid having conversations that aren't authentic to them. So if you are not a religious person, then I probably wouldn't have a religious conversation, because it's going to come off as inauthentic and non-caring. So if you feel uncomfortable having that conversation, it's okay to say, you know what, I have a colleague who could probably really help you explore this conversation better than I can, and really letting someone else do that. For me personally, I use a lot of and statements. So I don't want to look at things as the options are either a miracle happens or death happens. I try to look at things as and so I try to use statements like, I am hoping for a miracle for you as well. And I'd like to talk about what it would look like if the miracle that you so desire isn't exactly what happens the way that you want it to. So I try to use a lot of and statements, but I feel comfortable doing that. I'm sorry, I'm rambling. Keith, you said I'm talking too much. I feel that way.
No, this is.
But if I could highlight anything of what I just said to just really summarize it, if you don't feel comfortable having that conversation, that's okay. Please lean into the people that are on your team who feel comfortable having that conversation.
Absolutely.
Maggie, I really appreciate what you just said. And I think there has been a tremendous focus on interdisciplinary teams, on interprofessional education. The World Health Organization wants us to learn about, from, and with other disciplines. I will say, though, a patient wants to hear from their physician. They want to hear the diagnosis from either the physician or the PA. They want to hear it from their provider. So one of my goals, having moved over to the School of Medicine, is to try to infuse some of this content that we're talking here just in the general curriculum for the medical students. So that's one of my goals.
I love that.
And I think there's opportunities for the other disciplines to help prepare the patient and family for asking questions that signal to the doctor it's okay to have these conversations. And because I think when a patient or family or surrogate come and they have questions and they're like, I'd really like to talk about what would happen if my COPD got worse. And I have fears about that. And opening that door, I think oftentimes even when medical providers are able to have the conversations, they're pressed for time and they never know if they open that door what they're going to get back. And sometimes the path of least resistance is move on, and if they don't bring it up, I'm not bringing it up.
Yeah.
Which,
And the
yeah.
thing I will say to this is just a random point is I think from a patient's point of view, they want to have these conversations with the doctor that they feel most comfortable with. And so oftentimes that's the physician they've had the longest relationship with, or their primary oncologist. But on the flip side, if you're the provider, studies have shown the longer you know a patient, the less likely you are to have this conversation. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there. But I do think that really encouraging the physicians or PA, whoever it is that has a really close relationship with the patient, I think patients respond better to the people they feel most comfortable with.
Yeah, I agree. And it's another study also shows the longer that a physician knows a patient, the less accurate they are with prognostication. The more they assume that somebody has a longer length of stay, and because we're all human, and
Exactly.
And so that does create challenges, certainly. Are there other stumbling blocks that you see that patients or families, kind of things that you see get thrown out there that cause clinicians to stumble? I love the idea that a miracle is not a stop sign. Are there other curveballs that you find it's important to include in your training?
I will speak some to what's going on inside of us for those of us who are in healthcare. I think sometimes, I'm always amazed at no matter what class I'm teaching at how smart everyone is. I wonder if I'm smart enough to find my own keys by the end of it, because the folks who are coming into medicine are bright. I think sometimes we focus on our intellect and don't do enough introspection into how do our spiritual views enter into this? How is it helping? How is it hurting? How are our views, our experiences of death in the ICU for our family members? How does that affect us? And sometimes we get so focused here that we forget that this is another lens that can sometimes cloud that intellectual lens as well.
I think one of the other things is to engage in a conversation about quality of life versus quantity of life, and doing that with both the patient and teaching students to be able to engage in that conversation and what the difference looks like.
Yeah, I think both of those, I'm sorry. I think both of those points are also really lovely. Of course, my phone ringing just totally made me lose my train of thought, which is a great point to say if you're having a serious conversation to make sure everything's muted. But I think I'm going to stop there because I don't even know where it's going.
So Deb Love had a question, and I think it actually applies to all disciplines. If we're going to do this well, we need to be listening more than we're speaking. And sometimes in hurry and in discomfort, we come in with an agenda, and it's actually out of the narratives. When I actually did spend time with patients as a chaplain, being able to hear their stories, you gain a lot of insight frequently into why they're resistant to having the conversation, why they're saying do everything, and what their goals are. And so learning about their life really is learning about the patient and entering more into a sacred space of trust.
I've seen an increase in the topic of person-centered care across disciplines. It's not just emerging from social work. You're hearing about person-centered care in other disciplines, including medicine, which I think just drives home the need to get to know the individual, to listen to their stories, and to know their history.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I just, it just came to mind. I was called by actually occasionally clergy in the community will ask if I'll go visit someone, and I have no magic in my quill, but I asked one question and then didn't leave for 45 minutes, and that was a patient who was getting ready to go home for hospice care. I said, "What are you most proud of in your life?" And and he just went on and on and on, and it was a beautiful story, and it was again a very precious space. And this man who was going home to hospice was smiling and laughing and crying and all these things. And there's one of those days where I thought, I got paid to do this. I got paid to be in this space. I think it's easy sometimes for us to forget um, the sacred nature of what we get to do. There are always things that we don't like to do. They wouldn't pay us if it was all great. But just walking away thinking, wow, I got to be in this space with this man. I wish we could maintain that.
Keith, I think that, it's that presence and that is an art into itself, because our culture teaches us to do. And I think what you're describing is the value and sacredness of being and giving that gift of full presence, which is sacred. And it doesn't need to be a chaplain, we can all offer that sacred gift of presence. I'm wondering, is that something that you found is part of your training and part of what you're trying to impart to new clinicians?
I try to teach the art of silence. I, as a human being, am not a silent person. I am an extroverted extrovert. I fill every space with noise. And so that was something I really had to learn in all of my trainings, is that you can be with someone and be silent, and that is a response, but also a gift. And so that's something that I've tried really hard to learn in my own practice, and also tell other people about. Like, you don't have to have a response for everything, although we really want to. And I think that goes back to what Keith said and Denise said, just like, you're there. And for me, my lens as a hospice palliative care doc is like, my end goal is always trying to get someone to hospice or palliative care, and that's not everyone's goal. And so I really try to change that, and my goal to be, have I seen this person for who they want to be seen, and have I really impacted their life in a way that they felt was meaningful. And so that's challenging, but I think presence and silence can be what people need more so than words.
Absolutely. Well, as we are wrapping up, I know time has flown, but I would, as kind of our final comments, I'd love to, we've talked about a lot of things and a lot of the challenges as well as opportunities for helping people to learn how to do this art of the serious illness conversation. Maybe if we can just end with reasons to be hopeful of where things are headed, and that, while there's challenges, there's hope as well.
I will go first. Again, I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking, but I've been very encouraged really by the panel to hear the work that the two of y'all are doing. It sounds like across the board, we're all working with learners at different stages. And I think that is very wonderful. The fact that we're catching people in their learning stage so that we can somehow shape who they will be later in life, I think to me is very, very hopeful. And I just think that needs to continue. So keep up the good work, friends.
I'm always hopeful because I have more students every year that are interested in this. And I think that is a testament to the growing interest in wanting to do good in this type of work.
And my hope is based on, I guess, trajectory. When I went to PE school back in the 1800s, this kind of thing wasn't even part of the conversation. And yet what I've seen, even over the 11 plus years that I've been back in the medical environment, is a trajectory of people with good hearts trying different things. And the coalition is a great example of that. Having been born out of a prior thing with the North Carolina Institute of Medicine, I think the fact that we're here today demonstrates some hope.
Absolutely. And if we look at all of the people that are joining us live, as well as all of the people that we know are going to be watching this later, there's a lot of people who see value and are doing good work. And, we're each able to model, and that exponentially we're able to, bring this knowledge to many, many people. So I want to just thank all of you here on this panel and thank all of you who are joining us today. It's been an honor. Thank you so much. And I'm going to give it back to Heather.
Oh my goodness. Thank you all. I so need to practice the art of silence. I won't do it now, but for those of you who know me well, I couldn't even be silent on the chat. Thank you. Dr. Maggie, you and I need to hang out a bit and just talk and then try to be silent. I don't think that will happen. This was a great session. Cannot thank Christine. Thank you for bringing everyone together, and to the members of the clinical practice and quality team, Denisa and Dr. Maggie and Reverend Keith. I think you all have shown us, to use the word that you used, Keith, hope, that there is hope, that there is thoughtfulness and compassion out there. And we just have to, can a Jewish girl say, sing the gospel of getting this out into our educational spaces so it can be in practice. As many of you know, I don't just come at this as a professional in this space, but as a daughter and a family caregiver, and have gone through this journey with my parents. And so I thank you. I thank you from the patient's perspective for this support. Would love for you all to join us tomorrow for our last session, our the caboose of the symposium. It is at 11 a.m., not 8:30. It is at 11 a.m., the same Zoom link. And I think it really will bring this all together, and looking at empowering tomorrow, navigating the future with advanced care planning, and really weaving in what's happening in the educational space with providers, what's happening in the faith community with education, what's happening with how we're supporting caregivers, both professional caregivers and family caregivers. So there's your commercial for tomorrow. But really, thank you so much to the panelists, and thank you to our audience members who were super engaged on the chat and with your presence and your silence to be able to listen to this wisdom. So with that, we end day 4 and look forward to, please go to our website. The recording will be up in just a few weeks, so we can, and hopefully I have your emails. Let's continue this conversation because there's a lot more work to be done. So thank you.